As we learned in the keynote, or as we were reminded in the keynote this morning, open research or open science, variously called those two things, represents a set of activities that make research more reproducible, enables collaboration, and offers ways to increase transparency and accountability. The demand for those services and activities is growing at a rapid pace, and I know from my work that part of the reason for that is the increasing levels of policies and mandates that are coming out from various governments, from various funders, and so on. So this thing of open research is not going anywhere, and it's only going to become more pressing over time, as David just said. So the concept of open science or open research, expressions of its definition vary across stakeholders, but the general principle is that we want to make as many aspects, as many outputs from all parts of the research cycle as open as possible and only as closed as necessary. Another way to express that, another lens to look at that, is that we need things to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, the so-called FAIR guidelines. So, of course, open science goes beyond open data. We've heard quite a lot about open data today already, and so we are going to touch on four different research activities that are involved in open science. We have a panel of 4 experts here, each one representing a different publisher. So we have 4 different publishers, and each one has in their teams working on a different aspect of open research. The first person speaking today will be Ian Hernaskovich. Did I get that right, Ian? That was close enough. So Ian Hernaskovich, there we go, I'll do that again, who is Director of Open Research Solutions at PLOS, where he heads a program of activities to increase adoption of open science practices, and he is going to be talking about open methods. Now remember that, open methods. The next speaker will be Miriam Mouse, beg your pardon. She's the Publishing Director at IOP Publishing and also a member of the Board of Directors there, and leads the creation and delivery of the publishing strategy, a portfolio of over 100 OA journals, hybrid journals, books, proceedings, and so on. And she's going to be talking about transparent peer review. So remember that, open methods, transparent peer review. The third part that we're going to be talking about is Dr. Erika Pastrana. She is the editorial director for Nature Research Journals and peer review and publication. She works on a series of initiatives for peer review and publication of code. So Erika is going to be talking about open code, as in research software. And Michael Cairns, last but not least, we have to have a special thanks to Michael, because he stepped in at the last minute to replace Rose Sokol, who also deserves our gratitude for the effort that she put into shaping this particular session. Michael is head of partner and channel development at the American Psychological Association. He's responsible for implementing APA's Open Access Journal program and developing some of the educational products as well. And he's going to be talking about open data policies. So we've got 4 different aspects of them. I shall go over them again. So make a note and think about it. We've got transparent peer review, we've got open methods, we've got open code, and we've got open data policies. So before I let my speakers speak, I'm going to ask the room, by a quick show of hands, who has got, or which organizations have got, or thinking about your own publishing organization, do you have a policy or a mandate around transparent peer review, or about peer review? So we've got a couple of hands over there. Not that many. We've got a handful. So who has got a policy or a mandate or open or initiatives around open methods? Who's working on open methods? Similar hand going up there. So we've got the usual suspects. All right. Who is doing any work, any initiatives, any mandates on open code? A few more. All right. So that's pretty good. So the last one, what about open data policies? So we've got a few more there, so probably about 20% of the room. So adoption of these things are in their early stages in many respects. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to these four folks talk about those initiatives, and while they're doing so, I want you to think about what's going on at your organisation. If you have any stories to share, if you have any questions about what you want to do within your publishing programs, and how the conversations are going with you. So the first person that we're going to have up is Ian, and I'll hand over to Ian.
So Ian from PLOS, going to be talking about open research methods. So these are one of several open research practices that we're trying to measurably increase adoption of at PLOS. And while we're waiting for the slides, just a point of clarification. When I say open methods, what I mean is information that generally isn't residing in the article, so sort of detailed step-by-step instructions, what you might call a protocol, rather than something that we might just see in the methods section. And I guess I'm in control. Yeah, there you go. I'm not waiting, just waiting for myself. So what I'm also going to do is share some research with you, some brand new research that was released yesterday. So let's hope everybody is prepared for that. So in terms of what the problems and opportunities are, it's long been complained about the insufficient details of research methods, limit understanding of research, limit reuse of research. And in terms of what publishers are doing, an example that PLOS has tried is that we partnered with a specialist platform for sharing detailed methods and protocols. It's called protocols.io. We've been encouraging researchers when they publish a research paper to put their detailed steps, their detailed experimental processes on there, and it's had modest uptake. When we wanted to think more deeply about this, how can we potentially come up with other solutions to increase adoption? We did some research, relatively informal, doing some interviews, did a few tests of different concepts with researchers. And we found that expert feedback is important to researchers when they develop or share a method, making it widely accessible, getting credit for methods development, and also the ability to version and modify methods and protocols in different contexts. But what we also discovered is actually there's very little known about what researchers' needs, preferences, behaviors are with respect to methods sharing, protocol sharing. We've probably all seen a lot of surveys about research data, however. So we went ahead and designed a survey, which we've just published the data and a preprint about, and we explored, well, in summary, we wanted to understand how and why researchers do or don't share methods. And some key observations. We asked to what extent the methods section of an article was helping researchers get 3 tasks done. Now, for the task of evaluating a paper, the methods section seems to be getting that job done. But to do something more involved, like reproducing results, extending or reusing a method, then generally dissatisfaction with just the methods section of the article for doing that. Another observation is that private sharing of methods and protocols is the dominant approach to sharing this information. However, there is a meaningful minority, about 33%, that are sharing this detailed methods information publicly. Now, of these public sharers that we've called them, in terms of how they're doing that, you'll observe that the journal article-shaped solutions are actually the most popular. So publishing a paper specifically about a method, perhaps in a specialist journal, but also sharing it as supporting information or an appendix. And the next most common option after that is a specialist platform for sharing detailed methods. So bioprotocol, protocol exchange, protocols.io, those sorts of things. Now, the popularity of journals for sharing this detailed methods information is perhaps a function of the features of methods sharing products and services that researchers actually told us were the most valuable. So this was a hypothetical, there wasn't a particular product in front of them, a number of features, and we asked researchers to rate their value. And you'll see that the things are very much journal-like, available open access, visible in scholarly indices, feedback on the organization of the method, and peer review. So these were the things which are obviously common to most journals, and therefore perhaps that's reassuring that if we have methods journals or article types that we might be meeting these needs. So in terms of additional solutions that we have since tried, bearing in mind what researchers are telling us they value, last year we launched a new type of article called a lab protocol, which aims to combine, I suppose, the best of both worlds. So this article doesn't actually have a methods section. We asked the authors to put their detailed steps, their protocol, on protocols.io, which is a much better place for that kind of content that might have lots of formulae, reagents, other experimental details, which is better served by putting it on that platform and enables it to be reused. Essentially what the article in PLOS One is doing is providing peer review of all the content and providing some context and, of course, giving the author some of those other features that they said they value in terms of the discoverability and accessibility and getting credit for sharing their methods. So last couple of slides. What have we learned so far in the, well, regardless of whether or not you do have specialist solutions for authors for sharing methods and protocols, you can probably do some simple things to actually help researchers with some of these issues. Looking at the free text comments of the survey, the most common complaint was word length restrictions on methods sections, which is really interesting to me as an open access publisher because I thought we solved that problem, you know, like 20 years ago, but clearly not. Similar with other kinds of policy interventions, if you encourage something, you only tend to get modest uptake. But as we've seen, researchers do value some of the features that are part of these products we're offering, but perhaps awareness could be improved. But I think another aspect of it, and this is sort of based on some more in-depth analysis we've done of publicly available protocols associated with PLOS articles, is that actually only a subset of those would actually meet the editorial threshold for publishing a new paper, even in a journal that we might call as a sound science journal. So I think we have to be flexible about the different approaches we use to promote this open research practice. And my other point is that, well, surveys are great, but they do have limitations in what they can tell you. Our survey was biased heavily towards PLOS authors and protocols.io users. It was relatively international, about 13% from Africa, for example, which is a higher rate than we've observed historically with some of our surveying. But what we actually need to do is, as well as what people say, we need to measure what they do if we really want to understand different research communities, if we want to see if there are ways to support them better to promote open research. So I think there's an old management saying about if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, or you certainly can't improve it. And so that's why my final slide, we're actually really interested in taking a much more data and evidence-based approach to understand what researchers are actually able to share and what they are sharing associated with their articles. So we recently announced something called Open Science Indicators. So every PLOS paper will be analyzed programmatically to determine if data is shared, if code is shared, if there's a preprint posted, and next year whether or not there's a protocol available. And that information is hugely valuable for understanding different research communities. It's certainly going to help us at PLOS do a better job, we think, but we also think that it might help other people, including other publishers, by giving a very rich set of data about how open research is actually being practiced and potentially motivate other people to take action to support a transition to open research. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. So one thing I did not miss during the years of Zoom meetings is high podium, so I'm just getting used to that again. Right, my name is Miriam Maus. I'm a publishing director at the Institute of Physics Publishing, and I've been asked to talk to you about our experience with transparent peer review. I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about what it is and what we at IOP Publishing understand when we say transparent peer review. So it's the making public of all materials related to the review of an article, so reviewer report and correspondence typically. Important point to note at this stage is that transparent peer review is not open peer review, so the peer review process works in the conventional way, either single anonymous or double anonymous, depending on the journal, and the transparency comes in after acceptance, and crucially only in our case if both the author and the reviewer agree to the transparency model. And we host the materials on a external platform. We use the Publons stroke Clarivate service. This is what it looks like. So you start off in IOP Science. This is our platform where you see the article, and then you find a logo which takes you through to the Web of Science, where you find the open peer review button, and then it then takes you through another site, and that's where you find the materials, and it shows you all the history of the peer review. So we show the various stages of the review process separately, and every review has a DOI, so it can be cited and referenced. Why did we do this? Why did we initiate this workflow? We have a whole host of activities around peer review and an ambition around doing our bit in making peer review better, higher quality, more transparent, more inclusive. We call that our peer review excellence program, and transparent peer review is one part of it. The motivations around our peer review excellence initiatives are really the four that are on this slide. So it's about accountability, making something public, in theory, raises the stakes. It makes the contributors more accountable to provide good, high-quality peer review that actually does improve the science. There is a desire here to recognize the contribution of reviewers. So as I said before, these reviews, once available on the Clarivate platform, can be cited and referenced, so it's easier for reviewers to point to the work they've done. We spend a lot of time and effort on resource on educating primarily early career researchers or anybody else who wants to learn about peer review, about what good quality peer review is and how to write a good review. So having real live reviews available for everybody to look at sort of supports that general effort. And then finally, it's about the value the peer review report adds to a research article. At IOP Publishing, we do all our peer review management in-house, so it's a really important part of what we do as a publishing organization and how we add value to science. So it's important for us to have an opportunity to showcase that. So where are we? We started this initiative in 2019 with a small pilot of 4 journals. And we are now at a stage where we've got the transparent peer review option for all of our proprietary open access journals. It'll probably take us another year or so to roll it out to all of our proprietary journals, including our hybrid journals. It's a new workflow. It touches multiple systems. It's not actually that straightforward to roll something like this out, especially in a peer review team that's always pressured. Peer review is a high pressure environment. We need to make sure that we introduce new things as capacity allows. And for a mid-sized organization like mine, that means we need to find the opportunities to get new workflows and systems into place. As I said in the beginning, we make this entirely voluntary, so transparent peer review only happens if both the reviewer and the author opt in. 50% of the authors say yes on average, 40% of the reviewers. That's been pretty consistent since we started the pilot. That's pretty consistent across all the journal types we publish, across the disciplines we cover. And what that means is that actually the actual number of articles that have transparent peer review is still relatively small. The vast majority of reviewers opt for anonymity. I think that was pretty expected when we started this project. And the thing to consider when you think about transparent peer review, I was actually quite surprised how few people have experimented with that, so maybe the next point is useful for some of you. There is a policy consideration, so if you introduce a new thing to the peer review process, editors have to be on board. Editors typically are concerned about putting reviewers off. They want to make it very, very easy for reviewers to say yes to review. This is why we have this very voluntary and very much focusing on the opt-in process. But there are also operational issues that we had to consider. the reason I showed you the slide about the various stages you have to go through to get to the open peer review was really to make the point that you have to be quite motivated to find it. It would have been much easier to have the transparent peer review artifact on our own platform, but again, that was a capacity issue. It would have taken us much longer to get going if we'd had to create that functionality on our open platform. So we went for a third-party solution to get going, but it's not necessarily the ideal experience. And then the final point I'm going to make, I'm going to leave you is, as I said before, this is part of a whole array of activities we undertake at IOP Publishing in the peer review space, driving excellence in peer review. And we've, at the same time as rolling out transparent peer review, we've also started a initiative that moves our journals to double anonymous peer review. So that's where authors and reviewers are not known to each other. Again, it's a voluntary process. The author can opt for that and make that possible. And we see these two initiatives sort of complementing each other. So the peer review process, which is conventional, and where we feel that by not knowing who the author is or who the reviewer is, we may help with some bias in peer review. And early indications of the feedback from that suggest that there is less bias if you double anonymize the process. And then the transparency and open science aspect comes in once an article has been accepted and is available on IOP Science. And that's me.
Great, thank you everybody. Thanks to the organizers for letting us talk about code. I'm Erica. I am editorial director for the Springer Nature, for the Nature journals in particular. And I'm going to talk to you about open code today and how we at Springer Nature see open code and support open code. And I'm hoping to make some points that are a bit new, because I think we've talked a lot about open science for the last few hours, so it's great. We all have the background now, so I'm hoping to bring in a few additional things for publishers to think about, in particular around peer review and the value that publishers can add to different research objects through peer review, supporting peer review. So I wanted to start off with a very general statement about open science, because I think publishers can be catalysts of open science, and I think definitely preaching to the choir. So it's through different evidence and surveys, as we've heard Ian say and others, authors tend to rely on publishers to help them support following open research practices. When we ask authors what would motivate them to share data, for example, as the State of Open Data report showed a few years ago, that the number one thing in their list would be if the publisher helps me do this or requires me to do this. Integrated solutions as well, I want to mention, such as the ones we've tried at Springer Nature with deposition of preprints, data, and code as part of the submission system of a paper can increase uptake of open science. So we can support that through our practices. At Springer Nature, we look at open research as a way to provide both the right policies for supporting authors as well as the right services. And a lot of these services will rely on partnerships, on how we team up with different platforms that we think are the most suitable platforms to deliver some of these outputs, which definitely are not the PDF. I don't think I have to convince you of this. Ian has already mentioned platforms for sharing protocols, which are uniquely designed for that type of research object. But there's also other ways to support authors in sharing data and code, as I'm going to talk to you about, through different platforms that are better suited for that purpose. So what was the first step that we took with promoting sharing of open code? The first step, the basis for any publisher, is to have a policy, to know what you want to do or what is required of your authors. So we started thinking about this a very long time ago. Best practice. So first we have to start with the beginning. What do we want to do when we want to think about what the right way to share code is as part of the research enterprise. And we've been thinking about this for a long time, we and others, so this is not done in isolation, but I think the consensus in the community is that code needs to be properly documented, much like data. It needs to have, for code specifically, a number of things. It has to have information about the dependencies, the operating systems, and the technical requirements that are needed for you to run the code, because that's obviously what most people want to do. We believe strongly, and this is where I hope you could add something to the discussion about open research, is that we as publishers have to think about what our role is with open science. We can facilitate sharing of the objects, but we can also think about adding value to those objects through peer review. And obviously, I strongly believe that the peer review process adds value to objects such as the article. So we are thinking about implementing that to the other research objects, and I'll tell you today about what we've done with peer review of code specifically. Like other research objects, they have to be recognized independently. They have their own place in science publishing, so we have to be able to ensure the permanence of the record for that object, much like we do with articles, and we know a lot about what the value of the DOIs are for articles. The same applies for any research object that we're supporting publication of. The version that was used to create the results that are described has to be permanently accessible. And this is something that for code is particularly important because repositories such as GitHub will not give you that. But I'll talk a little bit more about that. And recognition, we've talked about incentives a lot this morning, and it's really important that these objects have their own independent recognition, so they have to have their own independent identifier, and they can be cited in their own right. So all of this is summed up under the FAIR principles, which can be applied to code, and most of you will have seen the FAIR for research software paper that was released just a few days ago as well. So what have we done? I'm going to start with policies, like I said, and there's two ways to look at this. There's a very broad policy that most of our journals will follow, which talks about transparency in reporting. Much like with data, you start off by ensuring the paper contains a section where a description about the code that was developed is provided. So let me just clarify from the beginning, this will not apply to every paper. This will only apply to those papers where, as part of the research project, you're developing new code. Your lab has created a new software, just to clarify. So the first step is transparency. We ensure that in that paper there is a section that we call code availability section, and where the authors are going to be asked to describe where the code is, so that a reader can immediately know where it can find it. But we've taken several journals a step much further, and for several years now. And these journals are journals such as some of the Nature journals, where they publish heavily computational papers. The code is not just a part of the research, the code is really the central part of that paper. And we're seeing increasingly number of papers that rely on code, as we can imagine. So for those journals, we require the code to be shared. But it's not enough for the authors to share it at publications. That's definitely too late when the code is central to the paper. We ask the authors to send it to us at submission when we're going to peer review the paper. And we co-peer review the paper and the code together. Why we do this? We do this so that at the time of publication, you have a paper that's describing code where the code is directly accessible to the reader, but in addition, where we have the certainty that it has been verified by the peer reviewers. So again, going back to the discussion of how publishers can add value to open research, that is where I think we can step in. It's like we can add a level of quality control for objects that are increasingly going to be shared. So this, just going back, this workflow that I've depicted there with a cartoon is much easier to draw than it is to do. And I'm an editor, and I've handled these papers. So it's a lot of work on the author. We're asking them to share a number of files with us and to make sure all these things that I had listed in terms of documentation are properly there. It's a huge amount of work for the reviewer. because we're asking the reviewers not just to check the code in terms of is it all there, does it have the metadata, we're even asking them to run it, particularly for a paper where the code is really the key method that's being described, and it's a very impactful type of software. We want to make sure our readers, once they read that paper, they know the software is going to work, and anybody's going to be able to immediately use it. So we ask the reviewer to please install it in their local machine, and please, make sure it's all running properly. That's a huge amount of work for the reviewers, and definitely not something we can scale or do in all our journals. So a few years back already, and luckily for us, solutions starting to come in, platforms that were focused on the publication of code specifically. And that was great. That was around 2017, more or less, when we started paying attention to these solutions. But these solutions actually weren't designed for peer review. They were designed for publication. So the platform I'm going to talk to you about today is CodeOcean, which probably some of you know. It's a container platform. So it's not a static code repository like you might have. For example, even GitHub is a static repository, but Zenodo, others are. It is a container. It's an executable code repository, which means that it runs in the cloud. It contains the code alongside the data, alongside the environment, and any person accessing that particular code can investigate it, much like you would do in any static repository, can download it, visualize it, but you can also actually run it and reproduce the results on site. So we became very interested in this, not so much for publication of code, which is also amazing, but very much so for peer review, because we immediately identified that this would solve our problems with reviewers. It would enhance the paper in itself, and maybe I'm just going to jump here because I have it all written down, so it's easier. So we saw several advantages of using this kind of system. And what we did was integrated this platform into our workflows. So our authors then were invited to use this platform to deposit the code in peer review. So it wasn't just a mandate that we were throwing out there with no support. We required them to share it, but we told them we have this platform available to you free of charge. Go in and deposit your code there. Authors were supported by CodeOcean staff to actually build the container, because this is not intuitive for every single researcher. So that's another angle that's, I think, very important, how we can support researchers adopt open research practices, even if they're not experts in data science or in code. Once the platform was built, the capsule, as CodeOcean calls it, that contains the code and data, the CodeOcean team actually verifies that everything is running. So before they contact us that it is ready, they run the systems so that everything is ready to use. By that time, then, we can offer the reviewers a very different experience about code peer review, because we immediately tell them, here is a platform where you can check the code. You will be able to access it privately. It's a copy. We make a copy of the platform for peer review. And we give the reviewers actually running time for them to test the code for us. Upon publication, we also see advantages in the code being offered to the community, to all the readers, in an open platform that also has the right sort of functionality to investigate it. I'm going to just clarify here that this is just one option. If an author says, no, I'd rather use my folder in GitHub to share the code, that is perfectly fine. We also support them doing that. But there are advantages, so we try to obviously steer them that way. And my last slide, well, first the slides are weirdly formatted, I'm sorry for that. But here's some of the results we saw in the initial trials. We're going to start quantifying this much better now because we have a more integrated solution coming up. But for the initial trial, we saw a good, healthy uptake of the platform itself by authors that were offered the service. But we saw also a very encouraging engagement of the reviewers that were giving links, with almost all those links being accessed at least once during peer review, and very, very nice spontaneous feedback from the community. So I want to highlight what's on the right here, the code availability. This is what it looks to us as a best practice sharing of open code. You've got a DOI minted code repository where you know that code that was used in the paper is permanently accessible. That version and that version only. For reproducibility purposes, that's essential. However, you also want to encourage your authors to continue using GitHub by all means, because that's where they're going to continue to evolve the code, and any reader that wants the latest version of that software can access it there. So that's what we consider best practice. So where are we going with this? Most importantly, we want to integrate it better so that it's scalable and less work, so that it's a solution that we can offer directly through our submission platforms. This will enable us to reach more disciplines, gather data about code sharing behaviors, and uptake of these services. We want to continue working with the community. Much of our policies are built through conversations with important communities like Force 11 and NISO. And we want to increase the recognition of the code in the paper by adding visibility to the code and credit. I think that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael, and as Phil mentioned, I'm a last-minute substitute for Rose, who is our head of editorial. And she did tell me that if there are any questions from anybody here about what I'm going to talk about today, she's more than happy to respond by email. And our email syntax is very easy. It's first name, first letter of the first name, last name @apa.org. So it's rsocol@apa.org. Let me just talk a little bit about APA for those who don't know who we are. We're a member organization. We have approximately 150,000 paying members. We've been in business for over 100 years as a publisher. Our revenues are over $100 million on the publishing side, and the society as a whole is about 120 million. So you can see that we have a big impact as a publishing organization on what APA is able to do. In addition to our journal program, we also publish books. We have a children's books line, and we have some online textbooks, which are relatively new to us. We have 89 journal titles owned and published by APA, just about 200 employees, maybe a bit more than that. And all of what we do goes to support what APA as an organization is able to do, which is to expand psychology as a professional discipline. Equity, diversity, inclusion in our field is important to us, and also to bring a younger audience into the field of psychology. I'm going to talk about three main areas today, and the downside of going last is that you will hear a lot of what I'm saying here has already been repeated by some of, it has already been mentioned by some of my people on the other who went before me, so bear with me on that. So our data, I'm going to talk about incentives of authors, education for authors, reviewers, and editors, and improving efficiencies in the production process and the editorial process. So on incentives, the data sharing begins with the authors agreeing to share the data that they have together with their journal article, preferably during the peer review process, but certainly on publication. That requires a significant amount of work for to make that data usable and shareable, including isolating the relevant data that from the larger data set that is particular to the research, securing appropriate consent during that process and permissions, and also cleaning those files. So in that process, an obvious question for the author would be, so what's in it for them if they have to do all of this quote-unquote extra work? Back in 2018, APA began offering open science badges for the author on the article. And in some cases, given the sensitive nature of the data collected, certainly in psychology from human participants, we also advocated for protected access data. That's what, in this on the badge here, that's what the PA stands for. So authors who can't share the data publicly can make that data available to qualified scholars. An incentive that might be more relevant to editors and the publishers and the brand of the journal is the TOP factor, which is Transparency, Openness, Promotion Factor, issued by the Center for Open Science. Some of you may be familiar with this. And these are the top 3 journal titles that APA has with those rankings there. In terms of level of effort here, both of these are relatively easy for us to implement on the publisher side. That is, they require changes in journal policies, instructions to authors, and check boxes in peer review. So let me talk about education. So a barrier to some of this is really not understanding how to get started to make data accessible. And we created this How Do I Do It video that we put up on YouTube. And the link is there for anybody who wants to try that. But we did notice that compliance with this was low, so we offered an even lower barrier of entry to this process, which was a data availability statement. And again, some of you may use these as well. So if the author cannot or will not share their data, then they must explain why that is the case in the article. So for us, an ideal result is that we'll have data shared in a repository with a persistent ID, partnered with Center for Open Science, and our aspiration would be for the data upload to happen earlier in the peer review process in the same system, so that the reviewers and the editors are able to review the data together as the article passes through that editorial and production process. On to efficiencies. So the final barrier that publishers can help with is making the data deposit easier. And publishers, we think, from our experience, are good at finding and reducing areas of friction and standardizing processes. We've provided some tools like a branded repository with OSF that can integrate with peer review. And we're also providing transparency guidelines similar to with our APA-style journal article reporting standards. Attention on the author experience to remove those barriers or those hurdles to streamline the process. For example, introducing other efficiencies in peer review, such as moving our author forms from email to DocuSign. The peer review can now, we can introduce checks on whether the links are providing for data sets and so on. And then lastly, on compliance. So checking if the data set exists is relatively easy, as you can imagine. But whether or not it's the appropriate data based on the article is something that requires a little bit more expertise, especially in the discipline. So we rely on the editor and the reviewers to evaluate in the peer review process, and we have technical checks by staff upon submission to ensure that the journal requirements are being met. That is the existence of a data availability statement, the link to the specific data, and we have done and continue to create other opportunities and efficiencies in the peer review process that enables enhanced checks on this process. Authors might have other requirements related to institutional funder mandates. Having clear connections between the article and the data set ensures that authors will meet these requirements as well through this process. And having a clear sense of what the responsibility for each portion of the data sharing process is very important. So that's Rose's presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. But we're committed to this, and we believe it is a very, very important part of our process. So thank you very much.